that's it for presenting argument. If you had any more questions from that, feel free to utilize the chat to ask me. And now we'll move into argument analysis. So what are your criteria according to VCA? You need to be able to comprehend the material and contention. So understand the piece as a whole. What does the author think, feel, or believe, and want to happen? And this includes your visuals and your comments as well, any comparative material you may have. You need to be able to have a full picture to form a comprehensive interpretation. And of course, find the contention and arguments. Now, the quality of your analysis is the bulk of your marks. You should follow a structure to make sure that you do it properly, because it's quite easy to do this correctly. So we'll look at the what, how, why, or the feel, think, do methods. However, this is basically your, persuasive language technique quote, and use the meta language to say what persuasive language technique it is, and then analyze in terms of intended effect, or bring it back to the argument and how it reinforces or supports it. Doing that constantly. So never having, where you've included a quote and you haven't analyzed it, with the exception of you're combining quotes and you're saying this is further reinforced by blah blah blah. Otherwise, everything has to be analyzed. Never include quotes without analyzing, unless they were used for maybe some kind of a vocabulary effect, like in your topic sentence, to make it sound nice and fancy. So you can use some quotes just for that effect and to make your writing look good, but if you're including them as evidence, they have to be analyzed. Don't just put something there and move on. Similarly, can't move on without analyzing, and all analysis has to be justified by a quote. You cannot analyze if you don't have a quote and evidence to support what you're saying. Also, being specific with our analysis, related back to the particular issue, to exactly what the author is saying, making sure you have lots of creative ideas. You're not just analyzing surface level with really shallow, like boring ideas. That can take some practice. Do some activities where you take evidence and you brainstorm what it could mean and try to lead into some unique pieces of analysis. Be creative. Use ideas that have come up in your head while you've read the article that you're working with. And then, of course, expression and vocabulary. You need to use meta language. So for your persuasive language techniques, and good writer does words. In general, shows, says, and makes words to stay away from. All other writer does words are good. Just substitute for the bad ones with stronger, more specific writer does words, action verbs. And then we're looking at your word choices, grammar, and flow. If you're a student that is struggles to use a lot of elevated words and elevated sentence structures, and that often goes wrong, focus on being clear and concise in your assessments, and not trying to sound sophisticated at the expense of kind of butchering your vocab and your sentence structures. This is something you can work on in your own time, that sophisticated writing, when you do practice tasks at home. However, don't do it on your assessments, because clarity will be much more rewarded than failed attempts at elevated vocab. So let's look at those analysis strategies. So the what, how, why method, of course, you don't have to do the how and the why every single time. So the what is your evidence. What is the author doing? What language or techniques are being used? So you add a short quote, state what type of device the quote is consist of. You might combine a couple pieces of evidence to analyze together, or if it is just a quote, might just detail some explanation of what that quote means and how it's significant. Then you lead into your actual analysis. So the what is your evidence. How is your intended effect? How is the author wanting readers to feel or position them? And you can use this to include more discussion around audience, because this is actually on your rubric. You want to make sure that you mention audience, relate your analysis back to audience every once in a while to score good marks. Then the why is, why does the author want them to think? or feel or believe something, how does this essentially contribute or add to their argument? How does it add to that persuasive effect? So you might relate this back to the contention or the argument. Being very specific there. So an alternative version is this feel, think, do method. And this is still taking into account the how and why. We'll talk about how it relates. What emotion does the author want the audience to feel? And this is an emotion, usually just a quote. For example, in this example, we see embraced. That would be our evidence in this case, the what. In the case where we are just discussing what emotions it makes the audience feel, this is obviously our intended effect. How does the author want readers to feel? And what does the author want the audience to think? And what does the author want the audience to do? As you can see, do is clearly our why type analysis. So is think, but think can refer both to intended effect and analysis of contribution to the argument. So this method still does the same thing as the what, how, why method. It just doesn't remind you to include evidence every time, so be careful about that. If you find it easier to answer these questions rather than use the what, how, why, definitely give it a go. And we can see an example here of this being employed. By employing a tricolon crescendo that Australia could become a happy, thriving multicultural democracy, Morrison positions immigrant Australians to feel embraced. And that's our feeling, our emotion. They are thus likely to believe that Morrison is respectful and therefore place more trust in him as an authority figure. So the thinking, Morrison is respectful, Morrison understands how the people feel, and therefore he is more trustworthy. He has more authority because individuals feel as though they can relate to him. And there you go. That's that method. So in terms of persuasive language techniques, we want to really make sure that we have that mixture of obvious and subtle persuasive language techniques when we're analyzing argument in articles. So plan for the evidence that you will discuss in your body paragraphs as well. Don't just plan for where the argument is and then draw on the pieces of evidence that stick out, but you want to literally highlight and annotate and find some more subtle things like appeals and things to analyze. A lot of things that other students might be missing because they're sticking to the obvious things like all of your rhetorical questions, inclusive language, etc. Look for imagery, look for connotations, look for symbols, look for metaphors, and try to implement both into your analysis. So plan for what you use because you don't have a lot of time. You only have an hour to analyze what you choose to analyze. So you need to be smart with your time and choose valuable pieces of evidence. So there's just some tips. Connotations is a good note to keep in mind. And a lot of students don't do connotative analysis very well. They just say like negative connotations attached to or positive connotations without elaborating further. So you actually need to state what those connotations are. Maybe use the construction connotations associated with or connotations of, for example, a negative one would be suffering and misery. Like you need to just make it really specific to the piece of evidence that you're working with. Don't just leave it at negative or positive. But this is a very good example of a subtle persuasive language technique. Let's have a look at this example. So how do we do this looking for subtle persuasive language techniques? Looking at just a sentence. The Darling is suffering from record low flows, fish deaths, and algal blooms. This is referring to the body of water. So what's the most obvious thing that stands out? Just listing the structuring, low flows, fish deaths, and algal blooms. Well, that's the most plain and obvious thing. If we analyze this, it's not going to be anything too good or too valuable. But then we see that there's jargon that would be used by experts analyzing what's happening to the Darling as a body of water. So we see jargon of low flows and algal blooms. Of course, we know this could demonstrate some expertise, investment in the issue. Drawing a step further from that, we're looking at the individual words themselves. there is connotations of suffering, and personification as well. So the darling is being personified, even though it's a body of water. Because it's suffering, it's being assigned human qualities and features, to express that, it's suffering. And now this is not natural. This is intended, of course, to garner a lot of attention for the issue, and pity, and want to do something because it's wrong. So that personification has that emotional strong effect. And this is the subtle persuasive language technique that we've now been able to find. You can quite commonly see personification in a lot of argument analysis articles as well. It's a good one to go for. So now we're going to look at a specific task. We're going to read this letter to the editor, and we're going to apply the process of analysis to go through it step by step and see how you could do a detailed analysis plan. If you like the table that we're using to do the breakdown and you find that that's a pretty interesting, useful short task that you think you could do yourself, I definitely recommend it as well. So, stop the fear mongering so we can build confidence. I'm 53 and, like many people, hesitated about getting the jab because the risks seem to outweigh the benefits in a COVID free community. Like many, when the latest outbreak occurred in Victoria, I had my doctor talk sense into me and got myself in for my first vaccination. There was a lot of information, but I trusted the advice we were being given. I am 11 days post jab and I'm still staying vigilant for any side effects. Now I read that the threshold has moved and those under 60 are advised to ask for the Pfizer vaccine. What is someone like me supposed to feel? In this whole process, I feel as though we know too little, too much. We need to stop fear mongering and build confidence if we are to have any hope of achieving herd immunity. So this is hopefully, as we were reading for this, you're thinking about what is this argument, what is this contention embedded in here, and that's a crucial part of our planning as well. Essentially, this the author of this letter to the editor. This is all set in COVID times when older people were hesitant about getting vaccination in terms of the issue. So she is 53, but she is expressing that even though she similarly shared a lot of fear and hesitation in getting the vaccine, she expresses that older people need to, just as herself, need to sort of accept the necessity for it in order to protect the wider community. And also expressing the fact that she didn't have side effects, nothing happened to her. And that's sort of uh, a positive thing. It's more beneficial for the community overall. But another crucial part that's embedded within here is the discussion of what is someone like me supposed to feel in this whole process. I feel as though we know too little, too much. And those under 60 are advised to ask for the Pfizer vaccine now. It's all about the government response and how they've caused a lot of fear and disarray and lack of confidence in the government by spreading a lot of misinformation to the public around the COVID pandemic. And those are the key aspects of the argument that we find. So you need to have a think like that when you read through a text initially, pick out all the key parts, because a lot of your analysis that's going to come from evidence comes from understanding the piece overall. And you will draw those points from what you figured was the contention and what was those key points you thought were in the piece. So let's have a look. The first persuasive language technique plus quote that we'll have a look at is personal anecdote, or also building rapport. I'm 53 and, like many people, hesitated about getting the jab because the risks seem to outweigh the benefits in a COVID free community. So, the audience that she is targeting is older Australians who are currently skeptical about the AstraZeneca vaccine. She's trying to let them know that I, as well, felt this way. And share the same fears. Therefore, feel that they can relate and have a sense of understanding. Feel that their feelings are validated and what they're feeling is completely normal and natural to be worried about the vaccination. So they can feel heard, Validated, understood, a sense of this word means companionship or relatability. Um, they may think that vaccine hesitancy is widespread in the Australian community and that they're not alone in feeling this way. And how this contributes to her argument, it instills more trust in the offer as someone who understands their stance and has shared it. So you can see how this, directly correlates to the what, how, why process. If you'd like to view this table in a different way or adapt it for your own use, this PLT plus quote, that would be your what. Feel would be your how. Think and do. Do can be your why, and think, it depends if you're talking more about thinking emotional wise or in relation to the argument or the offer. It can be both how or why. Let's look at the next one. Rhetorical question. What is someone like me supposed to feel? She's again targeting these older Australians, and really drawing on that fact that she herself was affected by the issue. She listened to the same advice that the vaccination was safe, but then it was discovered that the AstraZeneca vaccine was not safe for older people. So the audience is older Australians who had listened to earlier advice that it was safe to take the AstraZeneca vaccine, intended to make them feel betrayed, skeptical, doubtful of their decisions, or, validated and understood, or a combination of both. Betrayed and skeptical and doubtful of the government, but validated and understood by the offer. And it's intended to make them think that their vaccine hesitancy is justified by the constant fluxes or changes in health advice. The government just rallying to get people to do one thing straight away for public benefit, without aiming to understand first the full effect of something. And it's intended to make them stop blaming themselves or their doctors for their vaccine hesitancy and instead blame the government. So positioning them against the government. Next and most interesting technique is this sentence. Hopefully it stood out to you during our reading. In this whole process, I feel as though we know too little, too much. There is both an ellipsis and a juxtaposition in here. Ellipsis is when something is omitted. So for example, this triple dot signifies that something's been omitted because we don't know what she knows too little or too much about, if that makes sense. And a juxtaposition is when we put things side by side that are kind of opposite or very different. So for instance, too little and too much are very different or opposite from each other. So what does this all mean? She's targeting the government as the audience here, which is different from before, and trying to sort of, make them feel sort of ashamed and guilty and change their approach, rather than being irrational and rushing things along, wait to get the full information and not misinform the public and provide different ideas and then those ideas sort of change. So intended for politicians who are responsible for delivering public health advice, make them feel ashamed or guilty, and make them feel that they have caused immense distress, emphasized by the ellipses, to the Australian public by constantly changing the health advice. And it can make them reflect on the impact that their fickle public communication has actually had on Australians. So, in terms of structure, that's what our body paragraphs look like. We have a topic sentence, analysis pretty much looks exactly like this, but in full sentences, and structured around them, and potentially some linking sentences to wrap up, refer back to the topic sentence. Then, of course, you might ask, introductions. There is a lot of elements. So we'll look at the structure of intros and visual analysis as well in more detail. So with our introductions, they have to include the issue. So you usually start by outlining what the issue is, what the piece is about. and then a few publication details. So the title of the piece, the source, this is the place and time or date of the publication. You can put it in brackets to cut down on writing time with just the comma between the place of publication and the date. And you can even stick that to the ends of sentences. The author's name, as well as the form or text type. There we still have a few different ones. We have blog posts, we have opinion pieces, we have articles, news articles. All of those are different text types, and you need to be able to differentiate. And then, of course, your comparative materials even more. Consider all the different types of visuals, photographs, cartoons, caricatures, drawings, so on and so forth. And then we might also see things like comments or letters to the editor. All you need to be able to differentiate. But yeah, so mention this form. I really consider it part of the publication details. I usually would just consider combining all four of these elements together in even one sentence. And then with your contention, your tone and audience, very easy to include as part of your contention sentence. If you'd like to elaborate on the audience a little bit further because you have a very interesting discussion, you can include a separate additional sentence following on after your contention about the audience. So consider the overall tone of the piece, excluding tonal shifts, and you can literally follow a structure of in a something adjective tone. Author's name contends that, contends helps to signpost that is your contention, or even contends to, and you can mention the audience members and detail your contention. Elements of a good contention need to mention if the author thinks the issue is good or bad and why, and what they want to be done about it. So their purpose, kind of what we looked at for presenting argument. And then if you do have standalone visuals, not embedded within an article, but standalone, so separate from the article, maybe attached after the article, you do need to mention them as well as any comparative materials, introduce them and their arguments at the end of all of these elements for your main article in the intro. Visuals need to be included if they're standalone. Embedded visuals are just part of other arguments that you are finding, you know, in the main article. They don't get their own argument or mention in the intro. So, for example, we're going to look at the example of this image. How would we introduce it in an intro at the end? Lemming's article is accompanied by a photograph, so stating the text type as well, of a young woman crowd surfacing at a music festival. So you need to detail what you can see in the image overall, supporting his assertion of the danger and recklessness of youth. And that's the argument there. So the idea is, and hopefully you all know this by now, we do not ever analyze an image in a standalone paragraph on its own. It's always attached to an argument. Even if it is a standalone image that has a completely different argument to our article, that would just mean that we have a comparative style body paragraph. We don't still give it its own body paragraph. All right, so let's kind of look at the do's and don'ts. This is a great example. This assertion of teen recklessness is bolstered by the prominent photograph showing a young woman crowd surfacing at a music festival. So again, detailing the text type and what you see in the image overall. Bolstered means it's reinforced. So this is how you introduce an image. Oh, okay, I've just analyzed something. It's semi-relevant to the image. I'll say that this is further reinforced by the accompanying image, which shows blah, blah, blah. And then analyze specific little things in that image that you find interesting, such as symbols, any text headlines, any interesting color choices, size, scale, what's in the foreground, background, central elements, quite an abundance of things to analyze. So here we've chosen the carefree nature and danger involved in the image would have been improved with the use of connotations. Maybe if we detail the appearance of the woman crowd surfacing, which causes some concern, and that she's probably not very staying safe, we should say. Those kinds of connotations, because crowd surfing is dangerous. It may position the parental audience, including audience discussion, to consider the recklessness of youth in such environments, and therefore question the viability of pill testing in mitigating risks to young people's health. As such, this exacerbated concern may promote a disassociation from the government's policy and its purported harm minimization, thereby generate support against it. Moreover, this is strengthened by the use of. So, what do we see? One thing was analyzed, the audience was mentioned, both the intended effect and the contribution to argument were analyzed very, very well. And then we're hinting that we're going to go back to the text and analyze further evidence, textual evidence in the text, persuasive language techniques, and quotes, and so on. And this is what visual analysis can look like. Now, what not to do, separate body paragraph. Additionally, a prominent photograph is embedded within the article in support of Lamming's contention. The image showing a young woman crowd surfacing at a music festival posits the parental audience to consider the recklessness of youth in such environments. As such, they may have a heightened sense of concern for their children. And you just see it's just rambling. You cannot do a standalone paragraph because you will not have good analysis. Visuals always go in paragraphs where you find a link or a gateway to bring in that visual. Either, I've analyzed something, it's completely different to the contention in the visual that I see, or it's really relates to this bit of evidence, so I'll bring it in now. And we see how this wasn't really even analyzing anything specific in the image, therefore it wasn't done well. So this is just what I'm talking about. Look for a link between the written and visual material, a piece of evidence, moving on from which it makes sense to say this is supported by, reinforced by, attached image that shows, and what do you see in the foreground, background, and the central element. Anything that's relevant. So when you first bring in a visual, the first thing that we've established we need to do is describe what you can literally see in it. And so all the relevant foreground, central elements, and background. So what do you see in the front of the image? What do you see in the back? And what is the main focus of the image? So in this case, central element would be the woman crowd surfing, and both in the foreground and background, lots of people, just a big crowd at the festival. Also consider the symbolic meaning of the visual. So this is you just doing the what, how, why process of analysis for things that you find interesting in the image and analyzing them. And you may even choose to summarize in your analysis, address how it adds to or detracts from the writer's argument. So still doing the what, how, why process. This is just the analysis part, so the how and why.